Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel where we explore the slow, the steady, and the wonderfully ordinary corners of history. Tonight we are settling in for a long, peaceful journey through one of the most fundamental aspects of human life before the age of machines. We are going to talk about how clothes were made before factories existed. This is the kind of history that rarely makes headlines, the kind of patient, repetitive work that occupied countless hours of human life for thousands of years. And there is something deeply soothing about exploring these quiet, methodical processes that shaped everyday existence for our ancestors. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if this kind of content helps you relax, and subscribe if you want more gentle historical deep dives. Let me know in the comments where you are joining us from tonight and whether you are using this to fall asleep or simply to unwind after a long day. It is always wonderful to hear from viewers around the world. Now settle in, perhaps dim the lights, find a comfortable position, and let us drift together through centuries of thread and fabric, needle and loom. In our modern world, clothing arrives in our lives with remarkable ease. We visit a shop or perhaps scroll through a website, and within days or even hours, new garments appear at our doors. We rarely pause to consider the astonishing complexity that lies behind even the simplest shirt or pair of socks. The machines that produce our clothes today operate at speeds and scales that would have seemed like pure fantasy to people living just a few centuries ago. A single modern textile factory can produce more fabric in a single day than an entire medieval village might have made in a year. But for the vast sweep of human history, things were profoundly different. Every thread had to be spun by hand. Every piece of cloth had to be woven on looms powered by nothing more than human muscles. Every garment had to be cut and stitched with patient, careful fingers. The production of a single outfit could represent weeks or even months of labor, and clothing was correspondingly precious. People owned far fewer garments than we do today, and those they possessed were maintained, repaired, altered, and passed down through generations. Tonight we are going to explore this vanished world in detail. We will examine the fibers that clothed humanity for millennia. We will follow the long, intricate processes that transformed raw wool, flax, silk, and cotton into wearable fabric. We will watch as spinners twisted fibers into thread, as weavers interlaced those threads into cloth, as dyers coaxed brilliant colors from plants and minerals and even insects. We will see how tailors and seamstresses shaped flat pieces of fabric into garments that fit the human body. And we will come to understand the social and economic worlds that organized all this labor, from domestic households to specialized guilds to sprawling cottage industries. This is not a story of dramatic events or famous individuals. It is something quieter and perhaps more meaningful. It is the story of ordinary people performing ordinary tasks, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. It is the story of knowledge passed from mothers to daughters and from masters to apprentices. It is the story of human hands creating the most basic necessities of life with nothing more than simple tools and patient skill. There is something deeply restful about contemplating this slower world, where the rhythm of work was measured not in seconds but in seasons, where the creation of cloth was woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Let us begin at the beginning, with the raw materials that would eventually become the clothes on human backs. The ancient fibers: wool, flax, silk, and cotton. Before there could be any cloth at all, there had to be fiber. And before there could be fiber, humans had to discover which materials in the natural world could be transformed into thread. This discovery happened independently in different parts of the world as people in various regions experimented with the plants and animals available to them. Over thousands of years, four great fibers came to dominate the textile traditions of different civilizations. These were wool, flax, silk, and cotton. Each had its own properties, its own challenges, and its own place in the human story. Wool is perhaps the most intuitive of the fibers to understand. Sheep grow coats of dense, curly hair to protect themselves from cold and wet weather. At some point in the distant past, humans realized that this same material could protect them as well. Archaeological evidence suggests that people have been using wool for at least 12,000 years, though the earliest wool was likely gathered from wild sheep rather than sheared from domesticated flocks. As humans began to keep sheep, they selected animals with thicker, finer coats, gradually developing breeds whose wool was better suited for textile production. The properties of wool made it ideal for clothing in temperate and cold climates. Wool fibers have a natural crimp or waviness that traps air, creating an insulating layer that helps retain body heat. Even when wet, wool maintains some of its insulating properties, making it valuable for people living in damp climates. The fibers also have a natural elasticity that allows woolen garments to stretch and recover without losing their shape. Wool can absorb a significant amount of moisture without feeling wet to the touch, which adds to the comfort of wearing it in variable weather conditions. Medieval England was particularly famous for the quality of its wool. The rolling green hillsides provided ideal grazing conditions, and English shepherds developed breeds of sheep whose fleece was prized throughout Europe. Regions like the Welsh Marches, the southwestern counties, and Lincolnshire produced wool that commanded premium prices in the markets of Flanders and Italy. The wool trade became so important to the English economy that a great wool sack was placed in the House of Lords as a symbol of the nation's prosperity, where it remains to this day. Flax is a slender plant with delicate blue flowers that has been cultivated for its fibers since the very beginnings of agriculture. The fibers lie within the stem of the plant, and extracting them requires a complex series of processes that we will explore in detail shortly. The resulting material is called linen, and it has properties quite different from wool. Linen is smooth, cool, and strong. It absorbs moisture readily and dries quickly, making it comfortable to wear in hot climates. However, linen wrinkles easily and lacks the elasticity of wool. The history of linen stretches back further than almost any other textile. Archaeologists have discovered dyed flax fibers in a cave in the country of Georgia that date back approximately 30,000 years, with some estimates suggesting they could be even older. Whether these ancient fibers were woven into cloth or used in some simpler way remains uncertain, but they demonstrate that humans recognized the utility of flax from very early times. By the period of ancient Egypt, linen production had become highly sophisticated. The Egyptians used linen for everyday clothing, for the wrappings of mummies, and for the sails of ships that traveled the Mediterranean Sea. The finest Egyptian linen was so delicate that it was nearly transparent, a testament to the skill of spinners and weavers who had refined their craft over generations. In medieval Europe, linen remained an essential fabric. Households from peasant cottages to noble manors cultivated flax and processed it into thread and cloth. Undergarments were typically made of linen because its smoothness was comfortable against the skin, and its ability to withstand frequent washing made it hygienic. The word linen eventually became a general term for household textiles like sheets and tablecloths, even when these items were made from other materials. This linguistic legacy reminds us of how central flax was to domestic life for centuries. Silk is the most exotic and mysterious of the great fibers, and its story is intertwined with some of the most famous trade routes in history. Silk is produced not by a plant or an animal in the conventional sense, but by the larva of a moth called the silkworm. As the caterpillar prepares to transform into a moth, it spins a cocoon around itself using a single continuous thread of silk. This thread can be nearly 1,000 meters long, finer than a human hair, yet remarkably strong for its weight. The Chinese discovered the secret of harvesting and weaving silk nearly 5,000 years ago. According to legend, an empress named Lezu was sitting in her garden when a silkworm cocoon fell into her cup of tea. As she retrieved it, the cocoon began to unravel, and she realized that the thread could be woven into fabric. Whether or not this story is true, it captures the almost magical quality that silk has always possessed in the human imagination. For nearly 3,000 years, China maintained a monopoly on silk production. The techniques of raising silkworms and processing their cocoons were closely guarded secrets, and according to surviving accounts, anyone who tried to smuggle silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China faced severe penalties. Despite these precautions, knowledge of sericulture eventually spread. The Byzantine historian Procopius recorded that silkworm eggs were hidden in the hollow staff of Christian monks who smuggled them to the Byzantine Empire around the middle of the 6th century, though some scholars question whether this account describes events precisely as they occurred. Other traditional stories tell of a Chinese princess who hid eggs in her elaborate headdress when she traveled to marry a foreign prince. The trade in silk gave its name to the most famous network of trade routes in history, the Silk Road. This was not a single road, but a web of paths connecting China to India, Persia, Arabia, and ultimately to the Mediterranean world. Along these routes, silk traveled westward while gold, silver, glass, and other goods traveled eastward. The Silk Road was a conduit not only for goods but also for ideas, religions, technologies, and even diseases. Buddhism spread from India to China along these routes, while papermaking and gunpowder eventually traveled in the opposite direction. Cotton is the fourth great fiber, and its history is as widespread as that of silk is concentrated. Cotton plants grow in warm climates around the world, and evidence of cotton cultivation has been found in both the Old World and the New World, in sites dating back thousands of years. The soft, fluffy material that surrounds cotton seeds can be spun into thread and woven into fabric that is light, comfortable, and durable. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, appears to have been among the first to cultivate cotton on a significant scale. Archaeologists have recovered fragments of cotton fabric from sites like Mohenjo-Daro dating to between approximately 3,250 and 2750 BCE, and cotton seeds from even earlier periods have been found at nearby sites. The technology of cotton processing appears to have spread from this region to other parts of Asia and the Middle East over the following millennia. For centuries, India remained the world's greatest producer of cotton textiles, and Indian cottons were traded throughout the ancient world. The cotton fabrics of India were legendary for their quality and variety. Some were coarse and utilitarian, suitable for everyday wear by ordinary people. Others were so fine that they seemed almost magical. The most famous of these was the muslin of Dhaka, a fabric so thin and delicate that a single piece could be drawn through a ring. Producing this gossamer cloth required growing a specific variety of cotton, spinning it with extraordinary skill, and weaving it with the most refined techniques. The process was so labor-intensive that a single piece of Dhaka muslin could cost a fortune, making it a possession of emperors and kings. Cotton reached Europe relatively late, arriving via trade routes that passed through the Middle East and the Mediterranean. For a long time, Europeans were confused about where cotton came from. Some ancient writers believed that cotton grew on trees, describing plants that bore tiny sheep on their branches. The German word for cotton, Baumwolle, literally means tree wool, preserving this early misunderstanding in the language itself. Each of these fibers required its own methods of cultivation, harvesting, and processing. Each had its own strengths and limitations, making it suitable for particular uses and climates. Together, they formed the foundation upon which human textile traditions were built. In the following sections, we will explore how these raw materials were transformed into thread and cloth through processes that were as time-consuming as they were essential to human life. Preparing the raw materials, from animal and plant to usable fiber. Before spinning could begin, the raw materials had to undergo extensive preparation. Whether the fiber came from the back of a sheep, the stem of a flax plant, the cocoon of a silkworm, or the boll of a cotton plant, it arrived in a form that was far from ready to be spun. Cleaning, sorting, and processing these materials was labor-intensive work that could take as long as the spinning and weaving that followed. Understanding these preparatory steps helps us appreciate the true scale of effort that went into producing cloth before the age of machines. Let us begin with wool, following the fiber from the moment it was sheared from the sheep. In the spring, when the weather began to warm and before the summer heat made thick wool coats uncomfortable for the animals, shepherds would gather their flocks for shearing. This was skilled work that required a steady hand and a sharp blade. A good shearer could remove the fleece from a sheep in a single piece, keeping the fibers as long and intact as possible. The shorn fleece was called a clip, and its quality varied depending on the breed of sheep, the conditions in which it had been raised, and the skill of the shearer. The freshly shorn fleece was far from clean. Sheep spend their lives outdoors, and their wool accumulated dirt, twigs, burrs, and other debris. More significantly, the fleece contained a waxy substance called lanolin, which the sheep's skin secretes to protect the wool from moisture. Lanolin made the wool greasy to the touch and prevented it from absorbing dyes properly. Removing these impurities was the first step in preparing wool for spinning. The initial cleaning process varied from place to place and era to era, but it typically began with sorting. Experienced wool workers could assess the quality of different parts of a fleece at a glance. The finest, softest fibers usually came from the shoulders and sides of the sheep. Coarser fibers from the legs, belly, and rear were separated for different uses. Particularly dirty or matted sections might be discarded entirely or reserved for the roughest applications. After sorting, the wool was washed to remove dirt and lanolin. This was done in large tubs or vats of hot water, sometimes with the addition of substances like stale urine or fuller's earth to help break down the grease. The ammonia in urine acted as a natural detergent, while fuller's earth was a type of clay that absorbed oils. Washing wool was tricky, because hot water and agitation could cause the fibers to felt, matting them together into a dense, tangled mass. Workers had to maintain a delicate balance, cleaning the wool thoroughly without damaging its structure. Once washed, the wool was spread out to dry, typically in the open air. This took time, especially in damp climates where rain might interrupt the process. Dried wool still contained impurities and required further cleaning. Workers would beat the wool with sticks to dislodge remaining dirt and to separate the fibers. This process was called willowing or bowing, and it produced clouds of dust along with increasingly fluffy piles of fiber. The next step was called carding or combing, depending on the type of yarn being produced. Both processes aligned the fibers and removed any remaining debris, but they produced different results. Combing used special tools with long metal teeth set in rows. Wool was placed on one comb and drawn through another at a right angle, untangling the fibers and arranging them parallel to one another. Combing removed shorter fibers, leaving only the longest strands, which produced a smooth, strong yarn called worsted. Carding used a pair of flat paddles set with short, curved wire teeth. Workers held one paddle in each hand and brushed the wool between them, first in one direction and then another. This process blended the fibers together rather than arranging them in parallel lines. The resulting mass, called a rowlag, contained fibers of various lengths pointing in various directions. Yarn spun from carded wool was soft and somewhat fuzzy, with a different character than worsted yarn. The choice between combing and carding depended on the intended use of the finished cloth. Combed worsted yarn was preferred for tight, smooth fabrics that would hold their shape. Carded wool was used for softer, warmer fabrics that were often further processed to create a dense, fuzzy surface. Many cloths were woven with a combination of both types of yarn, using worsted for the strong warp threads and carded wool for the softer weft. The preparation of flax for spinning was, if anything, even more labor-intensive than the preparation of wool. Flax is a bast fiber, meaning it comes from the inner bark of the plant's stem. Extracting these fibers required breaking down the outer layers of the stem and separating them from the usable material inside. This process took weeks and involved multiple stages, each with its own specialized vocabulary and techniques. Flax was typically harvested in late summer, when the plants had turned golden and the seeds were nearly ripe. Unlike most crops, flax was not cut with a sickle or scythe. Instead, workers pulled the plants up by the roots, preserving the full length of the stem fibers. The pulled flax was tied into bundles called beats or sheaves and left to dry in the field. Once dry, the seeds were removed in a process called rippling. Workers drew the stems through a large comb with widely spaced teeth, stripping off the seed heads. The seeds were valuable in their own right, used for planting the next year's crop, for feeding poultry, and for pressing into linseed oil. Nothing was wasted in the agricultural economy of the past. After rippling, the flax stems underwent a critical process called retting. The goal of retting was to rot away the pectin that bound the usable fibers to the woody core of the stem. There were two main methods: dew retting and water retting. In dew retting, the flax was spread thinly across a field and left for several weeks, exposed to dew, rain, and the action of bacteria and fungi. Workers turned the flax periodically to ensure even retting. In water retting, the bundled flax was weighted down and submerged in a pond, stream, or specially constructed pit. This method was faster but produced a stronger smell and could pollute the water. Judging when retting was complete required experience and careful observation. If the flax was under-retted, the fibers would be difficult to separate from the woody core. If it was over-retted, the fibers themselves would be damaged and weakened. Workers tested the flax by attempting to break a few stems and examining how easily the fibers came away. When the retting was judged sufficient, the flax was removed from the field or water and dried once again. The next stage was breaking or breaking. Workers passed the retted flax stems through a wooden device called a brake or flax brake. This consisted of hinged wooden blades that crushed the brittle outer layer of the stem, breaking it into small fragments. The breaking process required considerable physical effort and was often done by men, though many of the subsequent stages were typically women's work. After breaking came scutching, which removed the broken fragments of woody material from the fiber. Workers held bundles of broken flax against a wooden board and struck them with a flat wooden blade called a scutching knife or swingle. The wooden fragments, called shiv or boon, fell away, leaving behind bundles of long, smooth fibers. Scutching was dusty, tiring work that produced piles of discarded material along with the precious fibers. The final preparatory step was hackling or heckling. This involved drawing the scutched flax through a series of combs with increasingly fine teeth. Hackling separated the long fibers, called line, from shorter tangles called tow. Line flax was used for the finest linen thread, while tow was spun into coarser yarn suitable for rougher fabrics or for rope and twine. The hackled flax was smoothed and aligned, ready at last for spinning. The preparation of silk and cotton followed their own distinctive processes. Silk cocoons were carefully sorted and then immersed in hot water to soften the sericin, a gummy substance that held the silk filaments together. Workers then found the end of the silk thread and unwound it, combining threads from several cocoons to create a strand strong enough for weaving. This process, called reeling, required a delicate touch and constant attention. A single cocoon could yield nearly 1,000 meters of silk thread, but any break in the filament created a flaw that affected the quality of the finished fabric. Cotton bolls were picked by hand, a tedious process made more difficult by the sharp, dried leaves that surrounded the fluffy fiber. Once harvested, the cotton seeds had to be removed from the lint. In India, this was done using a device called a churka, or roller gin, which squeezed the cotton between two rollers and expelled the seeds. This simple machine was in use for at least 1,000 years before the famous cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney in the 18th century. Once ginned, the cotton was cleaned, carded, and prepared for spinning using techniques similar to those used for wool. All of these preparatory processes shared certain characteristics. They were slow, requiring many hours of patient work. They were often performed by women and children, though men might handle the heaviest tasks. They took place in homes and small workshops rather than centralized facilities, and they represented a substantial portion of the total labor required to produce finished cloth. When we think about clothing production before factories, we must remember that the spinning and weaving that come to mind first were only the middle stages of a much longer chain of work. The art of spinning, transforming fiber into thread. Once the raw fibers had been cleaned, sorted, and prepared, the work of spinning could begin. Spinning is the process of twisting fibers together to create a continuous thread or yarn. This simple principle underlies all textile production. Without spinning, there could be no weaving, no knitting, no sewing. Every piece of cloth that has ever existed began as a mass of loose fibers that someone twisted into thread. The basic mechanics of spinning are straightforward. Fibers are drawn out from a prepared mass and twisted as they are extended. The twist causes the individual fibers to grip one another, creating a strand that is far stronger than any single fiber. The more twist applied, the stronger and tighter the resulting thread. Different amounts of twist produce threads with different properties, some loose and soft, others hard and wiry. The skill of the spinner lay in maintaining consistent thickness and twist throughout the entire length of thread. For thousands of years, the primary tool for spinning was the spindle. At its simplest, a spindle is nothing more than a straight stick onto which spun thread is wound. The spinner pulls fibers from the prepared mass, attaches them to the spindle, gives the spindle a twist, and allows it to drop while drafting out more fiber. The weight of the falling spindle maintains the spinning motion, allowing the twist to travel up the forming thread. When a sufficient length has been spun, the spinner winds the thread onto the spindle and begins again. Most spindles were weighted with a small disc or whorl that increased their momentum and helped maintain a steady spin. Spindle whorls have been found at archaeological sites dating back at least 12,000 years, making them among the oldest identifiable textile tools. Whorls were made from many materials depending on what was locally available. Stone, bone, ceramic, glass, and metal whorls have all been recovered from ancient and medieval sites. Some whorls were plain and utilitarian, while others were decorated with patterns or inscriptions. Lead whorls with letters or symbols have been found in considerable numbers from the medieval period, suggesting that even this humble tool could carry meaning beyond its functional purpose. The design of spindles and whorls varied significantly across time and place. The spindles used in medieval Europe were typically small and light, with whorls positioned near the bottom of the shaft. These spindles spun very quickly but for relatively short periods, requiring frequent winding. The speed was well suited for producing fine, tightly twisted thread suitable for weaving. Modern drop spindles often have larger rim-weighted whorls that spin more slowly but for longer periods, but this design appears to have been less common in pre-industrial times. The way spinners held and operated their spindles also varied. In medieval Europe, spinners typically did not drop their spindles freely through the air in the manner commonly taught today. Instead, they held the spindle in one hand and controlled its rotation directly, keeping the forming thread at an angle across their body from a distaff tucked into their belt or held in the other hand. This technique allowed very fine control over the spinning process and produced thread quickly once the spinner had developed the necessary skill. A distaff was an essential companion to the spindle. This was a stick, sometimes elaborately decorated, around which the prepared fiber was wound. By holding the distaff steady, the spinner could draw out fibers with a consistent pull, maintaining even thickness in the forming thread. Distaffs came in many sizes and styles. Some were short, designed to be held in the hand. Others were long poles that rested on the floor or were tucked into the spinner's belt. The fibers wrapped around the distaff were sometimes covered with a cloth to keep them clean and orderly. Spinning was primarily women's work throughout most of human history. The association between women and spinning was so strong that it shaped the language itself. The word distaff came to refer to the female side of a family, in contrast to the spear, which represented the male side. An unmarried woman was called a spinster because spinning was the work she would do before marriage and might continue throughout her life. In many cultures, a woman's skill at spinning was considered a reflection of her character and worthiness as a potential wife. The amount of time spent spinning was staggering by modern standards. A skilled spinner might produce several hundred yards of thread in a day's work, but a single garment required thousands upon thousands of yards. To put this in perspective, historians have calculated that weaving just 1 yard of cloth required several hours of spinning to produce the necessary thread. This meant that for every hour a weaver spent at the loom, multiple hours of spinning had to occur beforehand. Some estimates suggest that spinning consumed more total labor hours than any other step in cloth production, exceeding even the weaving itself. Because spinning was so time-consuming, it was performed whenever possible throughout the day. Women spun while watching children, while tending animals, while walking to market, while visiting with neighbors. The spindle and distaff were portable tools that could be carried anywhere and set down at a moment's notice. Spinning became so integrated into daily life that it was almost unconscious, a background activity that filled every spare moment. Medieval illustrations frequently show women spinning while engaged in other activities, reflecting the reality of how the work was performed. The spinning wheel, which eventually transformed textile production, was a relatively late innovation in European history. The earliest spinning wheels appeared in India or the Islamic world, probably sometime around the 11th century. They reached Europe by the 13th century and gradually spread across the continent over the following centuries. However, the spinning wheel did not immediately replace the spindle. For a long time, both tools were used side by side, often for different purposes. The earliest spinning wheels were great wheels or walking wheels. These large devices required the spinner to stand and walk back and forth while operating them. The spinner would draw out fiber and walk away from the wheel, stretching and twisting the forming thread. Then the spinner would walk back, winding the finished thread onto a spindle. This back and forth motion gave the great wheel its other name, the walking wheel. Great wheels were faster than hand spindles, but they were also large and immobile. They could not be carried outside or moved easily from room to room. They required a dedicated space, which was a luxury in small, crowded households. They also worked best for certain types of fiber and produced thread with characteristics different from hand-spun thread. For these reasons, the hand spindle continued to be widely used even after the spinning wheel became common. Later developments added treadles and flyers to the spinning wheel, allowing the spinner to sit while working and eliminating the need to walk back and forth. These improvements made spinning faster and less tiring, contributing to increased cloth production in the centuries leading up to the Industrial Revolution. However, spinning remained a bottleneck in textile production. Multiple spinners were needed to keep a single weaver supplied with thread, and the demand for yarn consistently outstripped the supply. The thread produced by spinning varied enormously in quality and character. Fine, smooth thread suitable for delicate fabrics required skilled hands and good quality fiber. Coarse, strong thread for workday cloth could be produced more quickly and from less choice materials. Some threads were tightly twisted for strength, while others were loosely spun for softness. The spinning imparted its own character to the finished cloth, and a discerning customer could often identify the source of a fabric by the nature of its thread. After spinning, thread often required additional processing before it was ready for the loom. Threads were wound onto reels for counting and measuring. They might be twisted together to create stronger, multi-ply yarns. They were sometimes soaked and stretched to set the twist and improve their smoothness. All of these steps took time and labor, adding to the already lengthy process of cloth production. Weaving through the ages, looms and techniques. With thread finally in hand, the weaver could begin the actual construction of cloth. Weaving is the interlacing of two sets of threads at right angles to one another. The threads running lengthwise are called the warp, while the threads running crosswise are called the weft. By passing the weft over and under the warp threads in various patterns, the weaver creates a stable fabric that cannot easily be pulled apart. The tools used for weaving have varied greatly across time and cultures, but all looms share certain basic features. There must be a way to hold the warp threads under tension. There must be a mechanism for creating a gap or shed through which the weft thread can pass. And there must be a way to beat the weft threads together to create a firm, even fabric. Different loom designs accomplish these goals in different ways, with consequences for the types of cloth that could be produced and the speed and ease of weaving. One of the oldest loom types is the warp-weighted loom. This vertical loom consisted of a top beam supported by two upright posts, often leaning against a wall for stability. The warp threads hung down from the top beam, weighted at the bottom with stones, ceramic discs, or other heavy objects. These loom weights kept the warp threads under tension, allowing the weaver to pass the weft thread through them. Archaeological evidence suggests that warp-weighted looms were used in Europe from the Neolithic period through the medieval era, a span of many thousands of years. Weaving on a warp-weighted loom was typically done from the top down. The weaver stood or sat before the loom and beat the weft upward, pressing each new row of weft against the cloth already woven. Two or more heddle rods attached to alternate warp threads allowed the weaver to create sheds quickly. By lifting one heddle rod and then another, the weaver could pass the weft thread back and forth without having to pick it through individual warp threads. Loom weights have been found in enormous numbers at archaeological sites throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world. They are among the most common artifacts at domestic sites from antiquity through the medieval period. Their abundance tells us that weaving was practiced in nearly every household, a fundamental skill that most women possessed. The weights vary in size and shape, suggesting that different looms and different types of cloth require different weights to maintain proper tension. Warp-weighted looms had certain advantages that explain their longevity. They could be set up in almost any space, leaning against a wall when in use and perhaps stored flat when not needed. They allowed for very long warps, as additional warp thread could be wound around the weights and unrolled as weaving progressed. They were relatively simple to construct from readily available materials, and the cloth they produced could be of excellent quality, including complex twill patterns that required multiple heddle rods. However, warp-weighted looms also had limitations. Weaving was relatively slow because the weaver could not throw the shuttle but had to pass it from hand to hand through the shed. The vertical position meant that gravity worked against the weaver, who had to beat the weft upward, and the width of cloth was limited by how far the weaver's arms could reach across the loom. Horizontal looms appeared in different forms in various parts of the world. In ancient Egypt, ground looms held the warp threads stretched horizontally just above the ground, with pegs anchoring the ends. The weaver crouched or knelt while working, which was less comfortable for long periods, but allowed the creation of wider fabrics. In the medieval period, horizontal treadle looms transformed European weaving. These looms held the warp horizontally between two beams and used foot-powered treadles to raise and lower the heddles. The horizontal treadle loom was a significant innovation that increased weaving speed and efficiency. By pressing down on a treadle with the foot, the weaver raised a set of heddles that lifted half the warp threads, creating a shed. The weft thread could then be passed through the shed with a thrown shuttle, moving much faster than when passed by hand. The beater, a frame holding a comb-like reed, was pulled forward to beat the weft into place. Then another treadle was pressed, raising a different set of heddles and creating a new shed. This process could be repeated rhythmically, allowing an experienced weaver to work with considerable speed. The adoption of the horizontal treadle loom in Europe is often associated with the 12th and 13th centuries, though earlier versions may have existed. This new technology had important social consequences. Treadle looms were larger and heavier than warp-weighted looms, requiring dedicated space and more substantial construction. Operating them required physical strength, as the repeated pressing of treadles was tiring work. Weaving on treadle looms increasingly became men's work, whereas weaving on warp-weighted looms had traditionally been done by women. This gendered shift in the textile trades had lasting effects on the organization of cloth production. The weaving process began long before the actual interlacing of warp and weft. Setting up the loom, a process called warping, was time-consuming and required careful planning. The warp threads had to be prepared in the correct order, with proper tension, and in numbers appropriate to the width and density of the intended cloth. Mistakes in warping were difficult or impossible to correct once weaving began. Many weavers used warping boards or frames to measure and organize the warp threads before transferring them to the loom. Once the loom was warped and weaving began, the weaver had to maintain careful attention to many details. The tension of the warp had to be even across the full width of the cloth. The weft had to be beaten with consistent force to create an even fabric. The edges of the cloth, called selvages, had to be straight and firm. Broken warp threads had to be repaired without creating visible flaws. All of these requirements demanded concentration and skill developed over years of practice. The patterns possible in woven cloth ranged from the simplest plain weave to elaborate figured designs. Plain weave, also called tabby, alternated the weft over and under single warp threads. This was the simplest and most common pattern, producing a strong, durable fabric suitable for many purposes. Twill weaves created diagonal lines by passing the weft over and under groups of warp threads in a shifting pattern. Herringbone, houndstooth, and many other patterns were variations on the basic twill structure. More complex looms with additional heddles allowed for even more elaborate patterns, though these required more time and skill to weave. The width of cloth was constrained by the width of the loom and the length of the weaver's arms. A single weaver working alone could typically produce cloth no more than about 2 feet wide. Wider cloths required 2 weavers working in tandem, passing the shuttle back and forth between them. This limitation explains why many historical garments were constructed from relatively narrow panels of fabric sewn together. Ships' sails, which needed to be very large, were typically made by stitching together multiple panels of linen cloth, each panel representing the maximum width a single loom could produce. The alchemy of color, natural dyeing before synthetic chemistry. The cloth that emerged from the loom was, in most cases, some shade of white, cream, gray, or brown, reflecting the natural color of the fibers from which it was made. Undyed cloth was perfectly serviceable and was worn by many people throughout history. But humans have always been drawn to color, and the desire to decorate cloth with vibrant hues gave rise to an entire industry of dyers and their complex arts. Before the synthesis of aniline dyes in the 19th century, all colors came from natural sources. Plants, minerals, and even insects were processed to extract pigments that could be applied to cloth. The chemistry of natural dyeing was intricate and demanding, though pre-industrial dyers understood it in practical rather than theoretical terms. They knew which plants to gather at which seasons, which mordants to use with which dyes, and which procedures would produce lasting colors as opposed to fugitive ones that faded quickly. This knowledge was precious and often closely guarded. The 3 most important natural dyes in medieval Europe were woad for blue, madder for red, and weld for yellow. By combining these primary colors in various ways, dyers could produce a wide range of hues including greens, purples, oranges, and browns. Black was particularly difficult to achieve and often required multiple dyings with different substances. Woad was the source of blue dye in Europe for centuries before the arrival of indigo from Asia. Woad is a flowering plant in the cabbage family that was cultivated extensively in regions like Languedoc in France, where the wool trade brought prosperity to cities like Toulouse. The dye was extracted from the leaves through a complex fermentation process that produced an intensely unpleasant smell. Woad production was often relegated to the outskirts of towns because of the odors it generated. Processing woad involved harvesting the leaves, crushing them into a paste, and forming the paste into balls that were allowed to dry. The dried balls were then broken up, moistened, and allowed to ferment further. This fermentation converted the precursor chemicals in the woad into indigo, the actual dyeing substance. The process required careful control of moisture, temperature, and time. Too much or too little fermentation could ruin the dye. Dyeing with woad required what is called a vat. Unlike many other dyes, indigo is not soluble in water. To use it, dyers had to create chemical conditions that reduced the indigo to a soluble form. This was done by creating an alkaline environment using substances like stale urine, wood ash, or lime. When cloth was immersed in this reducing vat, it absorbed the colorless, reduced indigo. Upon removal from the vat and exposure to air, the indigo oxidized and turned blue. The transformation seemed almost magical to observers, as fabric that emerged yellow or green from the vat gradually turned blue before their eyes. The depth of blue could be controlled by multiple dippings. Each immersion and oxidation added another layer of color. The rich navy blues favored by nobility required many dippings, making them expensive and time-consuming to produce. Paler blues could be achieved with fewer treatments. The quality of the blue also depended on the quality of the woad and the skill of the dyer. Madder was the primary source of red dye in Europe and much of Asia. The dye came from the roots of the madder plant, which were dried, ground to powder, and processed to extract the coloring matter. Unlike woad, madder required a mordant to fix the dye permanently to the fiber. A mordant is a substance that creates a chemical bond between the dye and the fiber, preventing the color from washing out. The most common mordant for madder was alum, a naturally occurring mineral that was traded across long distances. Alum from deposits in the Balkans and later from Italy was highly valued and carefully controlled. The cloth or yarn was soaked in a solution of alum before dyeing, allowing the mordant to penetrate the fibers. When the mordanted cloth was placed in the madder dye bath, the color bonded permanently, producing a lasting red. Different mordants could produce different shades from the same dye. Iron mordants produced brownish reds, while tin mordants created brighter oranges. Weld, also known as dyer's rocket, was the primary source of yellow dye. This plant grew wild across much of Europe and was also cultivated for dye production. Weld produced bright, clear yellows that were fast to light in washing when properly mordanted. By overdying blue woad with yellow weld, dyers could produce greens of various shades. This two-step process was known as Saxon green or Lincoln green, the latter famous from the Robin Hood legends. Beyond these three primary dyes, numerous other plants and substances were used for coloring cloth. Lichens produced purples and reds in some regions. Walnut husks and oak galls gave browns and blacks. Saffron, though better known as a spice, could produce brilliant yellows on silk. Brazil wood, imported from Asia and later from the Americas, yielded reds that were cheaper than those from kermes or cochineal, the insect-derived red dyes reserved for the most expensive fabrics. The famous Tyrian purple, worth more than its weight in gold in the ancient Mediterranean, came from the glands of sea snails. Thousands of snails were needed to produce a single ounce of dye, explaining its astronomical cost. Cloth dyed with Tyrian purple was reserved for emperors and the highest nobility. The association between purple and royalty persists in language and symbolism to this day. The dyeing process typically took place after weaving, though yarn could also be dyed before being woven. Dyeing loose fibers was less common because the additional handling could damage them. The choice of when to dye affected the character of the finished cloth. Yarn-dyed fabrics could incorporate multiple colors in complex patterns as different colored threads were woven together. Piece-dyed fabrics received their color after weaving and were typically solid or showed subtle variations where the dye penetrated unevenly. Dyers organized themselves into guilds that regulated their trade and guarded their techniques. The work was physically demanding, involving heavy lifting, constant exposure to water, and long hours standing in damp workshops. Dyers' hands were often stained with the colors they worked, identifying them immediately as members of their trade. Blue-handed woad dyers and red-handed madder dyers were common sights in textile towns across Europe. The chemistry of natural dyeing was poorly understood in scientific terms until the modern era, but practical dyers had accumulated vast empirical knowledge. They knew which waters gave the best results, often attributing the quality of local dyes to the peculiar properties of local streams or wells. They knew how temperature, time, and the phases of the moon affected their work. Some of this knowledge was genuine chemistry by another name, while some was superstition. Distinguishing between the two was often impossible, so prudent dyers followed all the established procedures to ensure consistent results. From cloth to garment, tailoring and hand sewing. After all the work of fiber preparation, spinning, weaving, and possibly dyeing, the cloth was finally ready to become clothing. But this transformation required additional labor and skill. Someone had to cut the fabric, shape it to the human body, and stitch it together into a garment that could be worn, washed, and worn again. Throughout most of history, this work was done entirely by hand, using needles and thread, scissors or shears, and an understanding of how flat fabric could be shaped to curve around the three-dimensional human form. The history of tailoring and garment construction reflects the broader history of clothing itself. In the earliest periods, clothing tended to be simple and relatively unshaped. Rectangles of cloth were wrapped, draped, or belted around the body with minimal cutting and sewing. The tunics of the early medieval period were constructed from fairly simple pieces, often rectangles or trapezoids, requiring only basic sewing skills to assemble. Fabric was expensive, and cutting it unnecessarily was wasteful. This changed gradually over the centuries. By the high and late medieval periods, clothing in Europe had become increasingly fitted and complex. Men's doublets clung to the torso, requiring precise cutting and shaping. Women's gowns flowed from fitted bodices with carefully constructed seams that followed the curves of the body. Sleeves were set into armholes rather than simply attached at the shoulder. All of these developments required more sophisticated cutting and construction techniques. The craft of tailoring emerged as a specialized profession, particularly in urban areas where wealthy customers demanded fashionable, well-fitted clothing. Tailors learned to draft patterns, cut fabric economically, and construct garments that fit well and lasted long. They worked primarily with wool cloth for outer garments and were distinct from seamstresses, who typically worked with linen for undergarments and household items. The tools of the tailor were simple but essential. Shears or scissors were needed to cut fabric. These were often heavy and spring-loaded, requiring considerable hand strength to operate. Needles of various sizes were used for different weights of fabric and thread. Thimbles protected the fingers from the constant pricking of needle points. Pins held pieces together before sewing. Pressing irons smoothed seams and set pleats. Thread was usually linen for strength, though silk thread was used for fine work on delicate fabrics. Before beginning to cut, a tailor had to measure the customer and determine how much fabric would be needed. Fabric was expensive, and wasting it was unacceptable. Skilled tailors could lay out pattern pieces on cloth in ways that minimized waste, a practice that became more sophisticated as clothing became more complex. The scraps that remained after cutting were saved for smaller uses or sold to others who could use them. The sewing itself was done by hand, stitch by stitch. A variety of stitches served different purposes. Running stitches, made by passing the needle in and out of the fabric in a straight line, were fast and suitable for seams that would not receive much stress. Backstitch, where each new stitch overlapped the previous one, created a stronger seam for areas that needed to endure tension. Whip stitch and overcast stitches finished raw edges to prevent fraying. Buttonhole stitch created neat, durable holes for lacing and later for buttons. The construction of a garment typically began with the main body pieces. The front and back were cut from the flat cloth, often with additional pieces called gores inserted to add fullness where needed. Seams were sewn and then finished to prevent unraveling. The raw edges might be pressed open and stitched down, or they might be enclosed in a fell seam that concealed them between layers of fabric. Sleeves were usually made separately and then attached to the body of the garment. Setting a sleeve properly was considered a mark of tailoring skill. The curved sleeve cap had to be eased into the armhole without puckers or tight spots. The sleeve had to hang correctly when the arm was at rest and move freely when the arm was raised or bent. Poorly set sleeves would bind, wrinkle, or pull the entire garment out of alignment. Finishing details took considerable time. Hems at the bottom of garments and at sleeve cuffs were usually folded under and stitched in place. Facings covered raw edges at necklines and front openings. Decorative elements like embroidery, applied trims, or contrasting fabric inserts added visual interest and demonstrated the skill of the maker. Even simple garments required careful finishing to look neat and wear well. The fitting of a garment during construction allowed adjustments to be made before final sewing. The customer would try on the partially assembled garment, and the tailor would mark where changes were needed. Seams might be taken in or let out, darts added to improve the fit, or lengths adjusted to suit the wearer's proportions. This iterative process of fitting and adjustment was essential for creating well-fitting clothes, especially for the fitted styles that became fashionable in later periods. Buttons were a relatively late addition to Western clothing, becoming common only in the 13th and 14th centuries. Before buttons, clothing was typically held closed with laces, ties, brooches, or pins. The introduction of buttons made fitted clothing more practical, as they allowed garments to be opened and closed more easily than lacing. However, buttons and buttonholes were labor-intensive to produce. Each buttonhole had to be cut carefully and then reinforced with closely spaced buttonhole stitches to prevent fraying. Clothing was expected to last for many years, and construction techniques reflected this expectation. Seams were strong enough to withstand repeated wearing and washing. Stress points were reinforced. Fabric was often lined or interlined to add body and durability. The investment of labor and materials in a garment was substantial, and people took care to maintain and repair their clothes rather than discard them. When garments did wear out or fall out of fashion, they were not wasted. Clothing was remade and altered to suit new wearers or new styles. Usable sections were cut out and repurposed. Worn fabric was cut into smaller pieces for patchwork or used as cleaning rags. The scraps from cutting new garments were collected and sold to paper makers who pulped them into rag paper. Nothing was truly thrown away in an economy where every piece of cloth represented hours of human labor. The social world of cloth guilds, cottage industry, and domestic production. The production of cloth and clothing before the factory age was embedded in complex social and economic structures. The work was not done in isolation, but was organized through households, communities, markets, and formal institutions. Understanding how this labor was coordinated helps us appreciate the full scope of pre-industrial textile production. In the earliest periods and in rural areas, cloth production was primarily a domestic activity. Each household was responsible for producing much of the fabric it needed. Women prepared fibers, spun thread, wove cloth, and sewed garments for their families. This work was done alongside other household duties, fitting into the rhythms of daily and seasonal life. During the winter months, when agricultural work was light, families had more time for spinning and weaving. The quality and quantity of cloth a household could produce depended on many factors. Wealthy households might have servants to assist with the work, allowing the production of finer and more abundant cloth. Poor households struggled to find time for textile work amid the many demands of survival. The size of the family, the health and skill of its members, and access to good quality fibers all affected what a household could achieve. Even in domestic production, some specialization existed. Not every household kept sheep or grew flax. Families might specialize in one or two stages of production and trade with neighbors for what they could not produce themselves. One household might supply wool while another did the weaving. Such local exchange networks allowed for more efficient use of time and skills without requiring formal market structures. As towns grew and economies became more complex, specialized craftspeople emerged who worked full-time at particular stages of textile production. Professional spinners, weavers, dyers, and tailors offered their services for payment. These specialists typically produced higher quality work than domestic producers because they devoted all their time and attention to their craft. They also benefited from dividing the production process with different workers handling different stages. Medieval towns saw the rise of guilds, formal organizations that regulated the practice of specific crafts. Textile guilds were among the earliest and most important of these associations. There were separate guilds for wool merchants, cloth sellers, weavers, fullers, dyers, and many other specialties. Each guild controlled who could practice its trade, set standards for quality, regulated prices and wages, and provided social welfare for members and their families. The guild system functioned through a hierarchy of masters, journeymen, and apprentices. A young person who wished to learn a trade would be apprenticed to a master, typically for a period of several years. During this time, the apprentice lived in the master's household, received training in the craft, and worked without wages in exchange for instruction. Upon completing the apprenticeship, the young worker became a journeyman, entitled to work for wages but not yet permitted to operate an independent business. To become a master, a journeyman had to demonstrate mastery of the craft by producing a masterpiece and gaining acceptance from the existing masters of the guild. This often required not just skill, but also financial resources and social connections. Over time, guild membership became increasingly hereditary, with masters' sons having advantages in admission that outsiders could not match. The guilds protected their members' interests but also restricted competition and limited opportunity for newcomers. Women's participation in guild-organized trades varied considerably. Some textile crafts were traditionally women's work, and female guilds existed in some cities, particularly in Paris, Cologne, and other centers where silk production was important. However, most guild regulations presumed male members, and women often participated in craft production only as the wives, widows, or daughters of guild masters. A widow might continue her husband's business after his death, but her rights were often limited compared to male practitioners. Alongside guild-based production in towns, a different system called the putting out system or domestic system organized much rural textile work. Under this arrangement, merchant manufacturers distributed raw materials to rural workers who processed them in their homes. The merchant might supply wool to be spun, then collect the yarn and distribute it to weavers, then collect the cloth and distribute it to dyers, and so on through each stage of production. The workers were paid by the piece rather than by time, and they used their own tools and worked in their own homes. The putting out system allowed merchants to mobilize a large and flexible workforce without the expense of maintaining workshops. Rural families appreciated the income, which supplemented earnings from agriculture. During the slack seasons of the farming year, entire families might devote themselves to textile work. However, the system also created dependencies and vulnerabilities. Workers had little bargaining power and accepted the prices the merchants offered. Quality control was difficult when work was scattered across many homes, and workers bore many of the costs and risks of production, including the expense of tools and the possibility of spoiled work for which they would not be paid. The putting out system expanded dramatically in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Some historians refer to this period as proto-industrialization, recognizing that large-scale manufacturing was developing even before the advent of powered machinery. Entire regions specialized in textile production, with most households participating in some stage of the work. The merchant manufacturers who organized this production accumulated capital and developed the commercial networks that would later support factory-based industry. The social implications of textile production extended beyond the immediate participants. The wool trade, for example, shaped the landscape of medieval England. Sheep pastures replaced cropland, and villages were sometimes depopulated to make room for grazing. The wealth generated by wool built great churches and manor houses that still stand today. The same was true in Flanders, where the cloth trade created wealthy cities and a powerful merchant class. Trade networks connected producers and consumers across vast distances. English wool traveled to Flanders for weaving, then to Italy for finishing, then to markets throughout Europe and beyond. Indian cotton fabrics reached Europe via overland and maritime routes long before Europeans learned to produce their own cotton cloth. Chinese silk flowed westward along the Silk Road, passing through many hands before reaching its final buyers. The textile trade was one of the great engines of pre-industrial commerce, linking distant economies and cultures. The many lives of a garment: maintenance, repair, and reuse. In a world where cloth was precious and labor-intensive to produce, the relationship between people and their clothing was fundamentally different from what we know today. A garment was not worn for a season and discarded, but was expected to last for years or even decades. The care and maintenance of clothing was itself a significant domestic task, consuming hours of labor and requiring skills that were passed down through generations. Understanding how people related to their garments helps complete our picture of pre-industrial textile culture. When clothing was new, it represented a substantial investment. Even a simple linen shirt embodied weeks of spinning, days of weaving, and hours of sewing. Woolen outer garments were more expensive still, requiring additional processing, like fulling and potentially dyeing before they could be made into clothing. The wealthy might commission fine garments from skilled tailors using imported fabrics, but even working people owned clothes that represented significant value relative to their incomes. This investment created powerful incentives for careful use and maintenance. Clothing was stored properly when not being worn, protected from moths and vermin. Wool garments were brushed regularly to remove dirt and to maintain the nap of the fabric. Linen undergarments, which were worn next to the skin and absorbed sweat and body oils, were washed more frequently, but even this washing was done carefully to avoid damaging the fabric. Laundering before the age of washing machines was a labor-intensive process that typically occurred weekly or even less frequently. The laundry day, often Monday, was one of the most demanding days in the domestic calendar. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams and heated over fires. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed, pounded, and rinsed through multiple stages. Strong lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat helped remove grease and dirt, though it was harsh on both fabric and hands. After washing, clothes were wrung out and spread to dry, weather permitting. The harshness of traditional laundering methods affected how clothing was designed and constructed. Linen, which could withstand the alkaline soaps and vigorous treatment of wash day, was preferred for undergarments and items that required frequent washing. Wool, which could shrink and felt if washed too aggressively, was brushed and aired rather than washed when possible. When wool garments did need more thorough cleaning, they might be taken to professional fullers who had the equipment and expertise to clean them without damage. Ironing and pressing were essential finishing steps that restored garments to their proper appearance after washing. Heavy irons were heated in the fire and applied to damp fabric to smooth wrinkles and restore shape. The process required skill to avoid scorching the fabric or creating new wrinkles. Pleats, ruffles, and other shaped elements might require special techniques to restore properly. Starching with mixtures derived from plants like wheat starch or root starches gave linen collars and cuffs their characteristic stiffness. When garments developed holes, tears, or worn spots, they were mended rather than discarded. Every household needed some skill in repair, and more elaborate mending might be done by specialized workers. Small holes could be darned with new threads woven across the gap to fill it in. Larger tears required patches or reinforcing stitches. Worn areas might be reinforced before they developed into holes, extending the life of the garment. The skill of invisible mending was highly valued. An expert mender could repair damage so carefully that the repair was barely noticeable. This required matching threads to the original fabric, understanding the weave structure well enough to replicate it in the repair, and executing the work with patience and precision. Such skill commanded premium prices and was sought after for fine garments where visible repairs would be socially unacceptable. As garments aged and showed wear, they were often altered or refashioned. Sleeves might be turned so that the worn side faced inward. Cuffs could be replaced when frayed. A dress might be taken apart entirely and reassembled in a new style, using the less worn portions in visible positions. Larger garments might be cut down to make children's clothing. The fabric itself was valued beyond any particular configuration, and as long as the cloth remained sound, it could be given new life in new forms. When garments were finally too worn to be repaired further, they began a second career as household textiles. A shirt too ragged to wear might become cleaning rags. Larger pieces of worn cloth might be used for wrapping or covering stored goods. The softest, most worn fabric was saved for uses where softness mattered, like baby cloths or bandages. Even the smallest scraps had value, whether for patchwork, stuffing, or sale to paper makers who processed rags into paper stock. The second-hand clothing trade was substantial and socially accepted in ways that might surprise modern observers. Worn but serviceable garments were routinely sold or given to those who could use them. Specialized dealers, sometimes called old clothes men or friperers, bought and sold used clothing. Fine garments that had belonged to wealthy owners might pass through several grades of subsequent owners, each a step down the social ladder until the fabric was finally worn beyond use. Servants often received cast-off clothing from their employers as part of their compensation. This clothing, though second-hand, might be finer than what the servant could otherwise afford. The practice was sometimes a valued perk and sometimes a source of resentment, depending on the quality of the garments and the manner of giving. Livery, the distinctive clothing worn by servants in wealthy households, was typically provided by employers and remained their property even while servants wore it. The elaborate court clothing of royalty and high nobility had its own life cycle. Such garments might be worn only a few times before being given away, donated to churches, or stored. The value of materials in these garments was enormous, and when they were finally disposed of, the gold and silver threads might be recovered by burning the fabric and collecting the metal from the ashes. Gems and precious metalwork were removed for reuse in new pieces. The fabric itself, if sufficiently luxurious, might be cut apart and incorporated into ecclesiastical vestments or altar hangings. Churches accumulated textile wealth over centuries through donations, bequests, and purchases. Vestments, altar cloths, banners, and wall hangings filled church treasuries. Some of these textiles were ancient, passed down through generations and centuries. The care and preservation of these fabrics was an important responsibility, and specialized ecclesiastical seamstresses maintained and repaired them. When textiles finally became too damaged for their original purpose, they might be cut down for smaller uses or preserved as relics if they were believed to have special significance. The funeral industry consumed significant quantities of textile. Shrouds wrapped the dead for burial, and the more elaborate funerals of the wealthy included costly textiles draping coffins and decorating churches. Much of this fabric was not recoverable after burial, representing a permanent removal of textiles from circulation. However, funeral textiles were sometimes reclaimed for reuse, particularly outer draperies that had not directly touched the body. The entire culture around clothing was shaped by its scarcity and value. Fashion existed, but it moved more slowly than in later eras. Styles that would be considered dated within a year today might remain acceptable for decades in the pre-industrial world. The expense of new clothing discouraged rapid changes in fashion, at least for ordinary people. The wealthy could afford to follow fashion more closely, but even they expected their finest garments to remain useful for years. The tools of the trade, simple implements of great importance. Throughout our exploration of pre-industrial textile production, we have mentioned many tools without examining them closely. These implements, though simple by modern standards, were essential to every stage of cloth making. Understanding the tools helps us appreciate how much could be accomplished with basic materials and human ingenuity. Many of these tools were made by the workers themselves or by local craftspeople, and their designs were refined over centuries of use. The preparation of wool began with shears for removing the fleece from the sheep. Sheep shears were large, heavy implements resembling oversized scissors with long blades and a strong spring to open them after each cut. The shearer held the sheep between their knees and worked systematically across the animal's body, removing the fleece in as few pieces as possible. Good shears needed to be kept sharp and might be resharpened several times during a day of heavy shearing. Carding was done with hand carders, a pair of flat paddles set with short wire teeth. The wire was embedded in leather strips attached to wooden backs with handles. Workers held one carder in each hand and drew wool between them in a brushing motion. The teeth separated the fibers and removed debris while blending the wool into an even mass. Carders came in different sizes and with teeth of different fineness for processing different grades of wool. Combing tools were larger and more formidable than carders, with long metal teeth set in rows on a fixed base and a handheld comb. The teeth could be 2 inches or more in length, requiring careful handling to avoid injury. The worker heated the comb slightly to help the fibers pass through more easily, then worked the wool between the heated combs to align the fibers and remove shorter strands. Combing produced longer, smoother fiber suitable for worsted yarn. The spindle, as we have discussed, was a stick weighted with a whirl, but the simple concept allowed for considerable variation in execution. Spindles ranged from rough sticks with holes drilled through stones to elegant turned wooden shafts with precisely made ceramic or metal whorls. The weight and shape of the whorl affected the characteristics of the yarn that could be spun. Heavier whorls produced thicker yarn, while lighter whorls allowed for finer thread. The placement of the whorl, whether at the top, bottom, or middle of the shaft, varied by region and tradition. Distaffs were even simpler in construction, often little more than sticks with notches or decorative carving. However, elaborate distaffs were made as gifts, particularly for young women about to be married. These might be carved with intricate patterns, painted with bright colors, or decorated with ribbons and beads. The distaff was so associated with womanhood that it became a symbol of the female sex in heraldry and language. The spinning wheel, when it appeared, was a more complex piece of equipment. A great wheel consisted of a large driving wheel connected by a band to a smaller spindle. The spinner turned the great wheel by hand to rotate the spindle while drawing out and twisting the fiber with the other hand. Later, treadle wheels added foot pedals that turned the drive wheel, freeing both hands for working the fiber. The flyer mechanism allowed the spun thread to wind onto a bobbin automatically, eliminating the need to stop and wind by hand. Looms varied enormously in size and complexity. The simplest backstrap looms required nothing more than a stick to hold the far end of the warp and a strap around the weaver's body to provide tension. Such looms were portable and could be set up almost anywhere. At the other extreme, large horizontal treadle looms might fill an entire room and weigh hundreds of pounds. Between these extremes fell countless variations suited to different types of weaving and different circumstances. The warp-weighted loom required loom weights, simple objects that were nonetheless carefully made. Weights needed to be heavy enough to provide proper tension, but not so heavy that they broke the warp threads. They needed holes or grooves for attaching threads. Weights were usually made from clay, shaped and fired to produce durable objects that could survive years of use. Stone weights were used where suitable stone was available. The shape of weights varied by region and era, and archaeologists use these variations to date and characterize textile production at ancient sites. Heddle rods and frames were essential for creating sheds in woven cloth. At their simplest, heddles were loops of string tied around individual warp threads and attached to a rod. Raising the rod lifted all the attached threads, creating a gap through which the weft could pass. More sophisticated looms had multiple heddle frames that could be raised in different combinations to create complex patterns. The arrangement of threads in the heddles determined what patterns were possible. The shuttle carried the weft thread through the shed. Early shuttles were simply sticks with thread wrapped around them. Later shuttles were boat-shaped, with pointed ends that passed easily through the shed and a hollow center that held a bobbin of thread. The flying shuttle, invented in 1733, allowed the shuttle to be thrown across wide looms rather than passed by hand, dramatically increasing weaving speed. However, flying shuttles became common only in the later pre-industrial period. The beater or batten pressed each weft thread against the previously woven fabric. In simple looms, this might be a stick or sword-like implement wielded by hand. In more developed looms, the beater was a frame holding a reed, a comb-like device with many thin teeth. The reed served the additional function of spacing the warp threads evenly. Pulling the beater forward pressed the weft firmly into place, creating a dense, even fabric. Finishing tools processed woven cloth into its final state. Fulling, the process of shrinking and felting woolen cloth, was originally done by stamping the cloth underfoot in troughs of water and soap. Later, water-powered fulling mills used heavy wooden hammers to beat the cloth automatically. Tenters, large frames with hooks, stretched the fulled cloth to dry it flat and even. The expression "to be on tenterhooks," meaning to be in a state of tension, derives from the hooks used to stretch cloth on these frames. Teasels, the dried heads of a thistle-like plant, raised the nap on woolen cloth. The hooked spines of the teasel heads caught fiber and pulled it up from the surface, creating the fuzzy texture characteristic of fine woolens. After teaseling, the raised nap was trimmed with large shears to create an even surface. This process might be repeated several times on the finest fabrics to achieve a smooth, lustrous finish. Dyeing required various vessels and implements. Large vats held the dye bath, while smaller pots were used for preparing mordants and auxiliary chemicals. Rods or poles stirred the cloth in the vat and moved it from one bath to another. Draining racks allowed excess liquid to run off before the cloth was dried. The dyer's equipment might be simple and improvised or elaborate and specialized, depending on the scale and sophistication of the operation. Needles and pins were essential for sewing, but challenging to make. Before steel wire could be drawn easily, needles were made from bone, thorns, or hand-forged metal. Each needle was individually crafted, making them valuable objects that were carefully preserved. Pins were similarly precious and were collected and stored rather than discarded. The pincushion became a standard household item partly because pins were too valuable to lose. Scissors and shears came in many sizes for different purposes. Large shears cut fabric, while smaller scissors trimmed threads and cut buttonholes. Making cutting tools that held a sharp edge and cut cleanly required skilled metalworking. The best shears were prized possessions that might be passed down through generations. The city of Sheffield in England became famous for its cutting tools, including scissors and shears that were traded throughout the world. Time beyond measure, the seasonal and ceremonial dimensions of cloth. Beyond the practical aspects of textile production and use, cloth held deeper meanings that connected it to the rhythms of the seasons and the ceremonies that marked important life events. These dimensions remind us that pre-industrial people did not relate to their textiles purely as functional objects, but invested them with symbolic significance that enriched their lives in ways that we might struggle to appreciate today. The agricultural calendar shaped the timing of textile work throughout the year. Spring brought sheep shearing, one of the key events in the rural calendar. After a winter of growing wool, sheep were gathered, washed if time permitted, and shorn. The shearing itself might be a communal affair, with neighbors helping one another in exchange for assistance with their own flocks. The piles of new fleeces represented potential income and a year's supply of fiber for domestic spinning. Summer was the season for growing flax, which ripened in August and September. The pulling, retting, and initial processing of the flax followed the harvest, adding to the demands on rural labor during an already busy time. Cotton, where it was grown, was harvested through the fall, with the bolls opening at different times and requiring multiple passes through the fields. Winter, when agricultural work slowed and days were short, was the prime season for indoor textile work. Families gathered around the fire, and the women and girls of the household spun, while others carded wool, wound thread, or performed other preparatory tasks. This was the season when most spinning occurred, building up stocks of thread that would be woven in the spring and summer, when longer days allowed more light for the detailed work of the loom. The making of clothing was often tied to life's ceremonies and transitions. A young person coming of age might receive new clothes marking their transition to adulthood. Marriage was typically accompanied by new garments for both bride and groom, with the bride's clothing often remaining her property in ways that other marital possessions did not. The wealthy prepared entire trousseaux of clothing and household textiles for new brides, collections that might take years to accumulate. Mourning had its own textile requirements that varied by culture and era. Some traditions called for specific colors or qualities of fabric during mourning periods. Black became associated with mourning in Western Europe, though this was not universal across time and place. Mourning dress might be required for extended periods, and the gradual lifting of mourning was marked by changes in the colors and styles that were permitted. Religious life was deeply intertwined with textiles. Churches and temples were draped with special cloths, and clergy wore distinctive vestments that changed with the liturgical seasons. The making and maintenance of these religious textiles was often considered a sacred duty. Wealthy women might spend hours creating elaborate embroidery for church use, offering their labor as a form of devotion. Festivals and holidays called for special clothing that people might wear only a few times each year. Sunday best was kept for church attendance and was more elaborate than everyday clothing. Major holidays like Christmas, Easter, or local saints' days might occasion the wearing of finest garments. The distinction between workday and festive clothing reinforced the special character of these occasions. The symbolic associations of different colors added meaning to clothing choices. Red often signified passion, wealth, or authority. Blue could represent constancy, faithfulness, or in some contexts, royalty. White was associated with purity and was worn by brides, baptismal candidates, and those in religious life. Black could signify mourning, humility, or authority depending on context. Yellow had negative associations in some times and places, being imposed on Jews, prostitutes, and others whom authorities wished to mark as outsiders. The quality and style of clothing communicated social position in ways that were often regulated by law. Sumptuary laws restricted who could wear certain fabrics, colors, and styles. Only nobility might be permitted to wear silk or fur in some jurisdictions. Specific occupations might be required to wear distinctive dress so they could be identified. These regulations were not always obeyed or enforced, but they reflected anxieties about maintaining social boundaries that clothing might otherwise blur. The possession of fine textiles was a form of wealth that could be displayed, stored, and passed down. Wealthy families accumulated collections of clothing, bedding, table linens, and wall hangings that represented substantial value. These textiles were inventoried, valued, and mentioned specifically in wills. The passage of a fine garment from mother to daughter or father to son carried emotional as well as economic significance. The storytelling and mythology surrounding textiles reflected their importance in daily life. Spinning appeared in countless folk tales, from Sleeping Beauty pricking her finger on a spindle to the Greek fates who spun, measured, and cut the thread of each human life. Weaving was a metaphor for creation, with the universe itself imagined as a cosmic fabric. The patience and skill required for textile work made it an apt symbol for the virtues expected of women. These ceremonial and symbolic dimensions gave textile production meaning beyond mere manufacture. The spinner at her wheel was not merely producing thread, but participating in ancient rhythms that connected her to her ancestors and would connect her to her descendants. The value of cloth was not only economic, but cultural and emotional. This depth of meaning is largely lost in our modern relationship with textiles, where clothing has become disposable and its production invisible. The geography of fiber, where raw materials came from. The materials that clothed humanity did not grow or graze everywhere. The geography of fiber production shaped trade routes, influenced settlement patterns, and determined what kinds of cloth different peoples wore. Understanding where fibers came from helps us appreciate the complex networks of production and exchange that supported pre-industrial textile industries across the world. Sheep could be raised in many environments, but they thrived best in temperate climates with moderate rainfall and abundant grassland. The British Isles offered nearly ideal conditions, with mild winters, cool summers, and rolling green pastures that seemed designed for sheep husbandry. Spain developed its own famous sheep breeds, particularly the merino, whose exceptionally fine wool became prized throughout Europe. The movement of merino sheep was restricted by Spanish law for centuries, with severe penalties for anyone who attempted to export the valuable animals. The mountainous regions of Europe supported different breeds suited to harsher conditions. Alpine sheep produced coarser wool that was nonetheless valued for its durability. Scandinavian breeds developed double coats with long outer fibers and soft underlayers, each suited for different uses. The diversity of sheep breeds reflected centuries of selective breeding to match animals to local conditions and desired wool characteristics. Flax required specific growing conditions that limited where it could be cultivated successfully. The plant needed moderate temperatures, adequate moisture, and soils that were neither too heavy nor too light. The regions around the Baltic Sea, including parts of modern Russia, Poland, and the Baltic states, became major flax-growing areas. Ireland developed a significant linen industry based on flax cultivation in its damp climate. Egypt had grown flax since ancient times, though its linen industry eventually declined as other fibers became more available. The mulberry trees that fed silkworms had their own geographical requirements. These trees grew best in temperate regions with distinct seasons, warm summers, and adequate rainfall. China's southern and central provinces provided ideal conditions, and when sericulture spread beyond China, it established itself most successfully in similar climates. The Mediterranean regions of Italy, France, and Spain developed silk industries, though none matched Chinese production in scale or quality. The limitation of mulberry cultivation to specific climates constrained where silk could be produced domestically. Cotton was a tropical and subtropical crop that required long growing seasons, warm temperatures, and either abundant rainfall or irrigation. The Indian subcontinent offered ideal conditions, and India remained the world's dominant cotton producer for millennia. The American South would later prove equally suited to cotton cultivation, with consequences that shaped world history. Egypt's Nile Valley supported cotton along with its ancient linen tradition. The Caribbean islands and parts of South America also grew cotton before and after European contact. The geographical distribution of fiber sources created patterns of trade that connected distant regions. English wool traveled to Flanders for weaving, then might be shipped to Italy for finishing before being sold throughout Europe and beyond. Indian cotton fabrics reached markets in Africa, Southeast Asia, and eventually Europe through networks of merchants operating by land and sea. Chinese silk moved westward along the Silk Road, changing hands many times before reaching its final destinations. These long-distance trades were among the most valuable commercial activities of the pre-industrial world. The concentration of fiber production in certain regions created wealth in those areas, but also vulnerabilities. Regions that depended on imported raw materials were subject to disruptions in supply caused by wars, trade disputes, or natural disasters. English clothmakers who relied on Spanish or German dyes found themselves at a disadvantage when those supplies were interrupted. The search for reliable sources of raw materials drove exploration and colonization as European powers sought to secure their textile supply chains. The economics of cloth, value, trade, and exchange. Textiles were among the most valuable commodities in pre-industrial economies, and understanding their economic dimensions helps us appreciate why so much labor was devoted to their production. Cloth served not only as a useful product, but also as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a measure of wealth. The economics of textiles shaped societies in profound ways. The value of cloth derived from the enormous labor embodied in it. We have traced the many stages of production from raw fiber to finished garment, each requiring hours or days of skilled work. When all this labor was summed, even a simple piece of cloth represented a significant investment of human time and effort. This labor value was reflected in prices that seem remarkably high by modern standards. A single good quality garment might cost as much as a laborer earned in several weeks or months of work. Because cloth was valuable, durable, and widely desired, it functioned as a form of money in many societies. Taxes and rents might be paid in cloth rather than in coins. Workers might receive part of their wages in fabric. Debts were denominated in and repaid with textiles. In some contexts, specific types of cloth served as standardized units of value, much as gold and silver coins did elsewhere. The Latin word for money, pecunia, derives from a word for cattle, reminding us that various commodities have served as money throughout history, with textiles among the most important. The cloth trade was a major driver of commercial development in medieval and early modern Europe. Merchant families who dealt in textiles accumulated fortunes that made them powerful players in politics and finance. The Medici of Florence began as wool merchants before becoming bankers and patrons of the Renaissance. The great trading cities of Flanders, Italy, and later the Netherlands owed much of their prosperity to the textile business. The infrastructure of commerce, from banking systems to insurance to transportation networks, developed substantially to serve the needs of the cloth trade. International trade in textiles was governed by complex arrangements that attempted to balance the interests of producers, merchants, and governments. Export duties, import tariffs, trade agreements, and outright bans shaped the flow of cloth across borders. England restricted the export of raw wool to protect its domestic weaving industry while taxing wool exports heavily to generate revenue. Various European countries banned or restricted the import of Indian cotton fabrics to protect domestic producers, though these restrictions were often evaded. The regulation of textile trade was a major concern of economic policy throughout the pre-industrial period. The value of textiles made them attractive targets for theft, and protecting cloth from criminals was an ongoing concern. Merchants traveling with valuable loads of fabric hired guards or traveled in armed convoys. Warehouses where cloth was stored needed strong locks and watchmen. The legal systems of the time prescribed severe punishments for textile theft, reflecting the seriousness with which society viewed such crimes. Pirates and highway robbers found cloth cargoes worth seizing, adding to the risks and costs of the trade. Credit and finance were essential to the textile industry because of the long time between investing in raw materials and receiving payment for finished goods. A merchant who purchased raw wool in the spring might not sell the finished cloth until the following year. Weavers and dyers needed working capital to buy materials and pay workers before they could collect from customers. Systems of credit, from informal lending among neighbors to sophisticated banking arrangements, developed to meet these needs. The bills of exchange that became fundamental to international finance evolved partly to facilitate the textile trade. The geographical separation between producers and consumers created opportunities for intermediaries who connected them. Traveling merchants, known in England as clothiers, visited rural areas to purchase cloth from domestic producers and transport it to markets. Factors and agents represented distant buyers and sellers, negotiating deals and ensuring quality. The putting-out merchants who distributed raw materials to cottage workers and collected finished goods were a type of intermediary particularly important in the textile industry. These middlemen added costs but also added value by connecting dispersed producers with distant markets. Voices from the past, what workers said about their labor. The people who actually did the work of spinning, weaving, dyeing, and sewing left fewer written records than the merchants and rulers who organized and profited from their labor. Nevertheless, glimpses of their experiences survive in various sources that help us understand how workers themselves viewed their textile labor. These voices remind us that the production of cloth was done by real people with their own feelings about their work. Songs and ballads composed by and about textile workers preserve some of their perspectives. Spinning songs sung by women as they worked often touched on themes of love, marriage, and the monotony of the work itself. Weavers' songs might celebrate skill and craftsmanship, or complain about low wages and hard conditions. These musical traditions provided entertainment during long hours of repetitive labor and created a sense of shared identity among workers in the same trade. Proverbs and sayings embedded folk wisdom about textile work into everyday speech. Many such sayings have survived into modern times even though their original contexts have been forgotten. The expression spinning a yarn for telling a long story derives from the association of spinning with women's conversation. Homespun came to mean simple or unsophisticated, reflecting the humble character of cloth made domestically. Dyed in the wool, meaning thoroughly or permanently imbued with some quality, comes from the practice of dyeing fiber before spinning, which produced more lasting color than dyeing finished cloth. Legal and administrative records sometimes captured the voices of textile workers, particularly when they were involved in disputes. Court cases over unpaid wages, disputes about the quality of work, and conflicts between workers and masters were recorded by clerks who sometimes included workers' own words. These records reveal concerns about fair treatment, adequate compensation, and respect for skill that would be familiar to workers in any era. Guild records provide another window into workers' perspectives, though these organizations represented masters rather than ordinary workers. The regulations guilds established about training, standards, and practice reflected craftsmen's understanding of their work and its requirements. The ceremonies and social activities of guilds expressed collective identities built around shared trades. When workers protested or went on strike, guild structures sometimes provided frameworks for collective action, though guilds were as likely to suppress worker militancy as to support it. Religious and moral literature sometimes addressed textile workers specifically, offering guidance that reflected assumptions about their lives and work. Sermons might praise the virtues of patient labor or warn against the sins that supposedly tempted workers in particular trades. Conduct manuals advised women on proper spinning behavior and the moral significance of their domestic textile work. These sources do not directly record workers' voices, but reveal what others thought workers should believe and how they should behave. Travel accounts by outsiders sometimes describe textile workers and their conditions. Foreign visitors to cloth-producing regions occasionally noted what they observed about working conditions, the characters of workers, and the organization of production. These accounts must be read critically since travelers brought their own biases and often misunderstood what they saw, but they provide perspectives that are otherwise unavailable. The physical evidence of workshops and tools also speaks to workers' experiences, though silently. The wear patterns on spindles and looms reveal how they were held and operated. The arrangements of workspaces show how labor was organized. The modifications and repairs made to equipment demonstrate workers' adaptations to their tools. Archaeologists who study textile production reconstruct working practices from such material evidence. As literacy became more widespread in later centuries, some textile workers left written accounts of their own experiences. Autobiographies, diaries, and letters by weavers, spinners, and other craft workers describe their working lives in their own words. These sources become more common approaching the Industrial Revolution, when the changes affecting textile workers motivated some to record their experiences for posterity. Such accounts often express nostalgia for older ways of working, even while acknowledging their hardships. The senses of cloth: sound, touch, smell, and sight. We have explored the processes of cloth production largely in terms of what workers did, but we might also consider what they experienced through their senses. The work of making textiles engaged all the senses in ways that are difficult to recapture today. Imagining these sensory dimensions helps bring the past alive in a more complete way. Sound accompanied every stage of textile work. The rhythmic thump of the loom created a pulse that filled the weaving room, audible even from outside the building. The spinning wheel added its own sound, a whirring hum that varied with the speed of operation. Carding and combing produced softer sounds of brushing and sliding. Dyeing workshops were filled with the sounds of bubbling vats, sloshing liquids, and the dripping of wet cloth. Fulling, whether done by human feet or mechanical hammers, produced a steady beat that could be heard across distances. Workers grew so accustomed to these sounds that their absence during breaks or at day's end created a palpable silence. Touch was essential to textile work in ways that modern machine production cannot replicate. Spinners felt the fibers passing between their fingers and knew by touch when the thread was forming properly. Weavers sensed the tension of the warp and the firmness of the beat through their hands and feet. Those who prepared fibers developed sensitivity to differences in quality that were difficult to see but easy to feel. The experienced workers' hands became instruments of remarkable precision, detecting variations too subtle for untrained perception. The textures of different fibers were as distinctive as their appearances. Wool felt springy and somewhat rough, with a warmth that derived from its natural oils. Linen was smooth and cool, with a crispness that softened with wear and washing. Silk had a unique slippery quality that no other fiber matched. Cotton combined softness with a slight fuzziness that was unmistakable to the touch. Workers who handled these materials daily knew them intimately through their fingertips. Smells pervaded the spaces where textiles were made. Raw wool carried the odor of the sheep, a lanolin richness that diminished but never entirely disappeared through processing. Redding flax produced some of the most objectionable smells associated with any craft, as the plant material rotted in water to release its fibers. Dyeing filled the air with the distinctive odors of each dye bath, from the cabbage-like smell of woad to the sharper scent of mordants and fixatives. Urine, used in various stages of processing, contributed its own unmistakable presence. Workers became accustomed to these smells and may scarcely have noticed them. But visitors to textile workshops often commented on the powerful aromas. Color was obviously central to the finished product, but the visual experience of production involved much more than the final hues of dyed cloth. Workers observed subtle variations in the raw materials that indicated quality and determined how they should be processed. The changing appearance of fiber through the stages of preparation told skilled eyes how the work was progressing. The vat of fermenting woad developed a characteristic purple iridescence on its surface when it was ready for dyeing. The moment of oxidation, when indigo-dyed cloth changed from yellow to blue as it emerged from the vat, was a visual transformation that never lost its wonder, even for experienced dyers. The light in which work was done affected both the process and the worker's experience. Natural light was essential for seeing the true colors of fibers and dyes. Spinning and weaving were easier in good light, and fine work was nearly impossible by candlelight or firelight. Workers planned their days around the available light, doing precision work when the sun was brightest and reserving darker hours for tasks that could be done by feel. The short days of winter limited what could be accomplished, while the long summer days allowed extended hours of work. These sensory dimensions connected workers physically to their labor in ways that are difficult to imagine in an age of machine production. The textile worker's body was fully engaged in the work, not merely observing or tending machines, but directly manipulating materials through processes that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. This embodied relationship to work is one of the things most profoundly changed by industrialization. Regional traditions and global connections. While the basic principles of textile production were similar across much of the world, regional traditions developed distinctive styles, techniques, and preferences that gave local cloths their characteristic qualities. These regional specialties were shaped by the natural resources available, by climate and geography, by cultural preferences, and by the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftspeople. Exploring some of these traditions helps us appreciate the diversity and creativity that flourished before standardized factory production smoothed away much of this variation. England was famous throughout medieval Europe for the quality of its wool. The mild, damp climate and rolling grasslands of the island provided ideal conditions for raising sheep, and English breeders developed strains whose fleece was prized above all others. The Cotswold breed, named for the region of central England where it was developed, produced a long, lustrous fleece particularly suitable for worsted yarn. The profits from wool built the magnificent churches that still stand in towns like Chipping-Campden and Northleach, monuments to the prosperity that sheep brought to these communities. For centuries, England exported raw wool rather than finished cloth, sending its fleeces to the skilled weavers of Flanders and Italy. These continental cloth-making centers transformed English wool into fine fabrics that commanded premium prices throughout Europe. However, English monarchs eventually sought to develop domestic manufacturing, imposing taxes on wool exports and encouraging skilled weavers to settle in England. By the later medieval period, English cloth was competing with continental products, and the nation was transforming from a supplier of raw materials to a manufacturer of finished goods. The Low Countries, comprising modern Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of northern France, were the manufacturing heart of the medieval European textile industry. Cities like Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, and later Amsterdam became wealthy through cloth production and trade. Flemish weavers developed techniques for producing exceptionally fine woolen cloth that was eagerly sought by wealthy consumers across the continent. The great cloth halls of these cities, some of which still stand today, testify to the importance of the textile trade in their histories. The cloth-making cities of Flanders became centers of political conflict as well as commerce. The weavers and other textile workers formed powerful guilds that at times challenged the authority of their rulers. Conflicts between workers and merchants and between cities and the nobility erupted into violence on several occasions. The famous Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302 saw Flemish craftsmen defeat a French army, a remarkable military triumph for commoners against the flower of European chivalry. This victory was commemorated in the golden spurs taken from fallen French knights, symbols of how the textile trade had created a new kind of urban power. Italy developed its own distinctive textile traditions, particularly in silk. Cities like Lucca, Venice, and Florence became renowned for luxury silk fabrics that dressed the European elite. Italian silk weavers developed sophisticated techniques for creating figured fabrics with intricate patterns of flowers, animals, and geometric designs. These damasks, brocades, and velvets required complex looms and highly skilled weavers, and they commanded extraordinary prices. The wealth generated by the silk trade helped finance the cultural flowering of the Italian Renaissance. The Mediterranean climate of Italy was not suitable for raising silkworms, which require mulberry leaves that thrive in more temperate conditions. Instead, Italian weavers relied on raw silk imported from further east, initially from Byzantine territories and later from Asian sources via long-distance trade routes. The value added by skilled weaving and finishing was substantial enough that Italian silk industries remained profitable despite the cost of imported materials. India had been a textile powerhouse for millennia, producing cotton and silk fabrics of legendary quality. Indian weavers developed extraordinarily fine cotton cloths, including the famous muslins of Dhaka that were so delicate they seemed almost immaterial. The skill required to produce these gossamer fabrics was developed over generations and could not be easily replicated elsewhere. European merchants who traded in Indian textiles struggled to understand how such fine work was possible. Beyond the exceptional fineness of their best work, Indian weavers excelled in decorated fabrics. Complex dyeing techniques produced vivid patterns that were color-fast and durable. The mordant printing and dyeing methods used to create chintz, a printed cotton fabric, were particularly admired. European attempts to imitate these fabrics often failed because the chemistry of the dyeing process was imperfectly understood. The brilliance and permanence of Indian dyes remained unmatched until the development of synthetic chemistry. China's contribution to world textile history centers on silk. For nearly 3,000 years, China maintained a monopoly on silk production, guarding the secrets of sericulture with penalties of death for anyone who attempted to smuggle silkworms or their eggs out of the country. During this long period, Chinese silk workers developed their craft to extraordinary heights, producing fabrics of unmatched quality and beauty. Silk became one of China's most valuable exports, giving its name to the trade routes that connected East Asia to the rest of the world. The techniques of silk production were eventually learned by other cultures, but Chinese silk remained highly valued for its superior quality. Chinese artisans developed advanced methods of weaving, dyeing, and embroidering that were not easily duplicated elsewhere. The elaborate silk robes of the Chinese imperial court represented the pinnacle of textile art, incorporating symbolic patterns, rich colors, and fine embroidery that communicated rank and authority. The Americas before European contact had developed their own sophisticated textile traditions, using fibers available in the Western Hemisphere. Cotton was cultivated in both North and South America, and the indigenous peoples of these regions developed spinning and weaving techniques independent of any influence from the Old World. The cotton fabrics encountered by Spanish conquistadors impressed them with their quality and variety, though these textiles would soon be disrupted by the devastating changes that conquest brought. In the Andes, alpaca and llama wool joined cotton as important fibers. The high-altitude conditions of the Andean plateau produced animals whose fleece was both warm and lightweight, ideal for the cold temperatures of the mountains. Andean weavers developed distinctive techniques, including warp-faced weaving and complex tapestry patterns that created images and symbols with cultural and religious significance. The textiles preserved from ancient Andean cultures rank among the finest examples of pre-industrial weaving anywhere in the world. West Africa developed its own weaving traditions, often using narrow strip looms that produced long bands of cloth. These strips were sewn together to create larger pieces, with the seams becoming a design element rather than simply a construction necessity. The kente cloth of the Akan people of Ghana became particularly famous. Its bright colors and bold geometric patterns recognized worldwide. Each pattern carried meaning, and the combination of colors and designs communicated messages about the wearer's identity, status, and intentions. The global trade in textiles connected these regional traditions in complex ways. Indian cottons reached markets in Africa and Southeast Asia as well as Europe. Chinese silk traveled westward along the Silk Road while European woolen cloth traveled eastward. The desire for foreign textiles stimulated long-distance trade and sometimes led to conflict when nations sought to control the sources of valuable fabrics. The textile trade was thus not merely commercial but also cultural and political, bringing distant peoples into contact and sometimes confrontation. The hours and days, the rhythm of pre-industrial textile work. Understanding how cloth was made before factories requires appreciating not just the techniques involved, but also the pace and rhythm of the work. Pre-industrial textile production operated on an entirely different timescale than modern manufacturing. Tasks that machines now accomplish in seconds or minutes once required hours, days, or weeks of patient human labor. This slower pace shaped not only the economics of cloth production, but also the daily lives of the people who did the work. Consider the simple linen shirt, an undergarment worn by people of all classes throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Producing such a shirt began with planting flax seeds in the spring. The plants grew through the summer and were harvested in late August or September. Retting the flax took 2 to 4 weeks, after which the stems had to dry for another period. Breaking, scutching, and hackling the flax to extract the usable fibers required additional days of labor. Only then could spinning begin. And spinning the thread for a single shirt might take a spinner working steadily for 40 hours or more. With the thread finally prepared, warping the loom took another day's work. Weaving the cloth for a shirt might require another week of labor, depending on the width of the loom and the skill of the weaver. The woven cloth needed to be bleached if white linen was desired, a process that could take weeks of repeated wetting, spreading in sunlight, and re-wetting. Cutting and sewing the finished garment added more hours. From planting to finished shirt, the process stretched across an entire year, with the equivalent of several weeks of full-time labor accumulated across the various stages. This reality had profound implications for how people related to their clothing. Garments represented substantial investments of time and resources that could not be easily replaced. People owned far fewer clothes than we do today, perhaps just a few outfits for their entire wardrobe. Clothing was carefully maintained, mended when it developed holes or tears, and altered to fit new wearers when the original owner no longer needed it. The second-hand clothing trade was substantial, with used garments passing through multiple owners over their lifetimes. The labor of textile production was distributed across the year according to the demands of agriculture and the calendar. Sheep were sheared in spring, when their winter wool was fully grown but before summer heat made thick fleeces uncomfortable. Flax was planted in spring and harvested in late summer. Many processing tasks were performed during winter, when shorter days and cold weather kept families indoors and agricultural work was light. The spinning wheel or spindle was a constant companion during these months, filling hours that might otherwise have been idle. Women bore the primary burden of textile work in most pre-industrial societies. From childhood, girls learned to spin, and they continued spinning throughout their lives. The expectation that women would spin was so universal that it shaped language and law. The term spinster for an unmarried woman reflects the assumption that spinning was what women did before marriage. In some legal systems, the products of women spinning belonged to them personally, providing one of the few forms of property that married women could control. The pace of hand textile work was slow by modern standards, but not necessarily unpleasant. Spinning could be done while sitting comfortably, often in company with others. Weavers developed rhythms of working that some found almost meditative. The repetitive motions became automatic with practice, allowing the mind to wander or engage in conversation while the hands continued their work. Unlike the relentless pace of factory machinery, hand production allowed for breaks, for variation in tempo, and for adjustments to the worker's energy and mood. However, the pressure to produce could also make textile work burdensome. When demand was high or deadlines loomed, workers labored long hours in conditions that were tiring and sometimes unhealthy. Spinners who worked by firelight strained their eyes. Weavers who sat for hours on end developed back problems. Dyers stood for long periods in damp workshops, handling materials that irritated skin and lungs. The romanticization of pre-industrial craft sometimes overlooks the hardships that workers actually experienced. Children participated in textile work from early ages. Young children could help with simple tasks like carding wool or winding thread onto spools. By age 8 or 9, many children were learning to spin. Older children might assist with weaving or other more complex operations. This early involvement in productive work was considered normal and necessary, though it sometimes came at the expense of other activities like play or education. The labor of children was simply part of how households sustained themselves. The household remained the fundamental unit of textile production, even as commercial operations grew larger and more complex. Whether cloth was made entirely for domestic use or for sale in distant markets, the work typically took place in homes rather than in purpose-built factories. The spinning wheel occupied a corner of the main room. The loom, if the household had one, might fill an entire room or outbuilding. Raw materials, works in progress, and finished goods were stored alongside the family's other possessions. Home and workplace were not separate spheres as they would become in the industrial age. The twilight of handcraft, approaching the industrial transformation. As the 18th century progressed, the traditional world of handmade textiles began to change in ways that would eventually transform it beyond recognition. The pressures of population growth, expanding markets, and increasing demand for cloth created incentives for technological innovation. The inventions that emerged in this period laid the groundwork for factory-based production, though the full impact of these changes would not be felt until well into the 19th century. The spinning bottleneck was the first problem inventors addressed. For centuries, the slow pace of hand spinning had limited how much cloth could be produced. Multiple spinners were needed to supply enough thread to keep a single weaver busy. Various improvements to the spinning wheel increased output somewhat, but the fundamental limitation remained. Thread production could not keep pace with demand. The spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves in the 1760s, allowed a single operator to spin multiple threads simultaneously. By arranging several spindles in a row and operating them with a single drive mechanism, the jenny multiplied the output of each spinner. Early jennies had 8 spindles, but later versions had far more, with some machines operating over 100 spindles at once. This innovation dramatically increased the amount of thread a single worker could produce. The water frame, developed by Richard Arkwright, used water power rather than human muscle to drive the spinning mechanism. This allowed for continuous operation, at speeds impossible for human operators. The water frame produced a different type of thread than the jenny, stronger and more tightly twisted, suitable for use as warp threads. Together with the jenny, which produced softer threads suitable for weft, the water frame could supply all the thread needed for weaving. The spinning mule, invented by Samuel Crompton, combined features of the jenny and the water frame to produce thread of exceptionally fine quality. Mule-spun thread could match or exceed the fineness of hand-spun Indian cotton, allowing British manufacturers to compete in markets that had previously been dominated by Asian producers. The mule became the dominant spinning technology in the cotton industry, though it required skilled operators to achieve its full potential. These spinning innovations created a new problem. Weavers could not keep up with the flood of machine-spun thread. For a time, hand weavers prospered as demand for their services exceeded supply. Wages rose, and weaving became an attractive occupation. However, this golden age for hand weavers was brief. Inventors soon turned their attention to mechanizing weaving as well. The power loom, developed through the work of Edmund Cartwright and others, applied water power and later steam power to the weaving process. Early power looms were unreliable and produced cloth of inconsistent quality, but improvements gradually made them competitive with hand weaving. By the early 19th century, power looms were displacing hand weavers in many segments of the textile industry. The weavers who had briefly prospered found their skills devalued and their livelihoods threatened. The factory system that emerged around these new machines was fundamentally different from traditional textile production. Instead of working at home, workers traveled to centralized factories where machines were concentrated. Instead of controlling their own pace, workers had to match the rhythm of the machines they tended. Instead of producing whole cloths through their own skill, workers performed specialized tasks in a division of labor that fragmented the production process. The social disruptions caused by industrialization were profound and painful. Hand spinners lost their occupation entirely as machines took over their work. Hand weavers experienced a long decline as power looms gradually dominated the industry. The skilled artisans who had once controlled the textile trades found themselves competing with machines that could be operated by less skilled workers, including children. The putting-out system that had organized rural textile production collapsed as merchants shifted their capital to factory production. The Luddite protests of the early 19th century expressed the desperation of workers whose livelihoods were being destroyed by mechanization. Groups of workers attacked factories and destroyed machinery, hoping to halt or reverse the changes that threatened them. These protests were ultimately unsuccessful, and many participants were harshly punished by authorities determined to protect industrial development. But the anger and fear that motivated the Luddites were understandable responses to the upheaval they were experiencing. Not all textile production shifted to factories immediately. Hand spinning largely disappeared, but hand weaving persisted in some regions and for some products well into the 19th century. Fine work, specialty items, and products for local markets continued to be made by traditional methods. In remote areas where factories had not yet penetrated, the old ways continued out of necessity. Even today, hand weaving survives as a craft tradition in many parts of the world. The full transformation of textile production from handcraft to factory industry took many decades and proceeded unevenly across different regions and different branches of the industry. Cotton led the way, with wool and linen following more slowly. Some stages of production, like sewing, remained substantially manual until the invention of the sewing machine in the mid-19th century. The pre-industrial world of textile production did not disappear overnight, but was gradually eroded over several generations. Learning the craft. Knowledge transmission across generations. The skills required for textile production were not written in books or taught in schools, but passed from person to person through direct instruction and observation. This oral and practical tradition of knowledge transmission was how textile crafts survived across centuries and millennia. Understanding how people learned these skills helps us appreciate the human relationships that sustained pre-industrial production. Girls typically learned to spin from their mothers, grandmothers, or other female relatives. The teaching began in childhood, with simple tasks like carding wool or winding thread gradually giving way to more demanding work. By the time a girl reached adolescence, she was expected to be a competent spinner, able to produce thread of acceptable quality and quantity. The years of practice that lay behind this competence were largely invisible, absorbed into the daily rhythms of domestic life. More specialized skills like weaving or dyeing were often learned through formal apprenticeship. A young person would be bound to a master for a period of years, living in the master's household and learning the trade through daily practice. The apprentice began with simple tasks and gradually took on more complex work as skill developed. The relationship between master and apprentice was as much personal as professional, with the master taking responsibility for the apprentice's moral development as well as technical training. The guild system formalized this training process in urban crafts. Guild regulations specified the length of apprenticeships, the ratio of apprentices to masters, and the standards that had to be met before a worker could advance. The masterpiece that a journeyman had to produce to become a master was both a demonstration of skill and a test that maintained quality standards across generations. These formal structures ensured that knowledge was transmitted systematically, though they also restricted entry into the trades. Much knowledge was transmitted not through formal teaching but through observation and imitation. Children grew up watching adults work and absorbed techniques without explicit instruction. The rhythms of work, the handling of tools, the small adjustments made in response to varying conditions, all of these were learned by watching and doing rather than by verbal explanation. This tacit knowledge was difficult to articulate, but essential to skilled performance. Regional variations in technique were preserved through these traditional modes of transmission. A spinner trained in one area would spin differently from one trained elsewhere, using different hand positions, different rhythms, different equipment. These regional styles represented accumulated adaptations to local materials and conditions, refined over generations. When people moved from one region to another, they carried their techniques with them, sometimes creating friction with established local practices. The loss of traditional skills is one of the lasting consequences of industrialization. When machines replaced hand production, the need to train new generations of hand workers diminished. Skills that had been passed down for centuries were abandoned within a generation or two. Elderly practitioners who had learned in the old way found that no one was interested in what they knew. By the time later generations became interested in preserving traditional crafts, many skills had been lost forever. A final thread. Reflections on a vanished world. As we come to the end of our long journey through the history of cloth before factories, it is worth pausing to reflect on what we have explored. We have traced the paths of fibers from sheep, plants, silkworms, and cotton bolls through the many processes that transformed them into fabric. We have watched spinners twist loose fibers into thread, weavers interlace warp and weft, dyers coax color from plants and minerals, and tailors shape flat cloth into fitted garments. We have seen how this work was organized through households and guilds, how it varied across regions and cultures, and how it eventually gave way to the machines of the Industrial Revolution. Throughout this exploration, we have encountered a world that moved at a pace almost unimaginable to modern sensibilities. The production of cloth was slow, labor-intensive, and inescapable. Nearly everyone participated in some stage of textile work at some point in their lives. The spinning wheel and the loom were as familiar to our ancestors as the smartphone and the automobile are to us today. Cloth was precious because the labor embodied in it was so substantial. There is something peaceful about contemplating this slower world where the rhythms of textile production were woven into the rhythms of daily life. The spinner at her wheel, the weaver at his loom, the dyer stirring her vats, the tailor threading his needle. All of these figures performed their work day after day, year after year, in patterns that remained largely unchanged across generations. There is a meditative quality to repetitive handwork that industrial production has largely eliminated. Yet we should be cautious about romanticizing the past. Pre-industrial textile production was often hard, tedious, and poorly compensated. Workers labored long hours in conditions that damaged their health. Women and children performed much of the work without recognition or fair payment. The beautiful fabrics that clothed the wealthy were produced by people who could rarely afford such luxuries themselves. The social structures that organized textile production were frequently exploitative, benefiting merchants and masters at the expense of ordinary workers. The Industrial Revolution transformed textile production in ways that brought both benefits and harms. Factory-made cloth became cheaper and more abundant, allowing ordinary people to own more and better clothing than their ancestors had possessed. But the workers in early factories often suffered terrible conditions, laboring long hours in dangerous environments for meager wages. The full benefits of industrialization would only be realized after decades of struggle for better working conditions, shorter hours, and fairer compensation. Today, most of the textiles we wear are produced by machines in factories scattered around the world. The distances between fiber and finished garment have stretched to spans that would have astonished pre-industrial producers. Cotton grown in one country may be spun in another, woven in a third, cut and sewn in a fourth, and sold in a fifth. The workers who produce our clothes are often invisible to us, their labor obscured by global supply chains and marketing that focuses on brands rather than makers. Perhaps there is value in occasionally recalling the older ways of making cloth, not because we should return to them, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but because understanding them helps us appreciate what has been gained and lost in the transformation of textile production. Every shirt in our closet represents someone's labor, somewhere, even if we do not see that labor or know those workers. The thread that connects us to the makers of our clothes stretches across time as well as space, linking us to generations of spinners, weavers, dyers, and tailors whose patient work clothed humanity for millennia. The history of cloth before factories is, in the end, a human story. It is a story about ingenuity and skill, about tradition and innovation, about labor and its organization. It is a story about how ordinary people met one of their most basic needs through countless hours of patient work. There is something soothing about this history, something that invites us to slow down and appreciate the quiet dignity of craft. In a world that often seems to move too fast, perhaps we can find rest in remembering how much was once accomplished through hands and simple tools, stitch by patient stitch. And with that thought, we come to the end of tonight's journey. I hope this exploration of how clothes were made before factories has been both informative and restful. If you found it helpful for unwinding or falling asleep, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more gentle historical deep dives. The history of ordinary life is full of fascinating stories waiting to be told, and I look forward to sharing more of them with you. Thank you for joining me tonight, wherever you are in the world. May you rest well, and may your dreams be woven with threads of peace. Until next time, good night.